Welcome to this week's installment of the Fitness Edda. I am your host, Eric Castiglione, owner and head coach of Viking Athletics. This week we're going to be talking about diets. Which diet is the best? We're going to cover several different choices out there. We're going to talk about what each diet is, who it might be good for, who would not do well on it, and again, the question, which diet is best, is honestly loaded. Because, spoiler, they can all work. So the better question is, which diet is best for you? And if we really want to get into more specifics, it would be for what purpose? Are you trying to gain muscle? Are you trying to lose fat? Are you trying to improve blood markers and improve your general health? The short answer is, the diet that you can stick to is the one that's best for you. Adherence is the key. Consistency works above all else. In terms of the specifics, whether it's low carb, high fat, carnivore, vegan, keto, all of them can work if you adhere to them. When it comes to fat loss, they all work the same way. They lead to caloric restriction. There is no magic. There is no biohack that you're getting. Pretty much every claim out there is exaggerated in some way, shape, or form, and we're going to get into that with specific interventions that we talk about, specific diets. But in general, they all work because in some way, shape, or form, they are limiting the amount of calories that you consume, leading to fat loss over time. If you have underlying health issues, a lot of these diets are sometimes recommended to treat specifics. I am not a doctor. I cannot recommend that for you. All I can say is that sometimes these are recommended for people with certain conditions. If you have an underlying condition, go see a doctor. Again, when calories and protein are equal, we see very little difference between these diets. It doesn't matter if you are low carb or low fat. When protein and calories are equated, both work. A recent study just came out talking about intermittent fasting versus typical caloric restriction. Both groups saw the exact same results. Slight difference, but for the most part, same results. So why we're doing this video is we live in a world where tribalism is pretty rampant. We see it in politics. We see it with religion. It's not enough that people are right and that find something that works for them. So what's right for me clearly has to be right for everybody else. That's the world that we live in, is that it's not good enough that it's working for you. We need to project it onto other people and get them over to our side. Nutrition's not a zero-sum game. What works for you may not work for somebody else based on their lifestyle. It doesn't mean that their approach is better or that it somehow negates what you're doing. And yet we see that a lot. People belong to certain camps or tribes. People make outrageous claims, and they want to be part of the group that is in the know, that is exclusive, and that is somehow better than everyone else. For me personally, I am diet agnostic. I'm going to work with my clients to help them do what is best for them. And I like to shed light and air out the bullshit. So if I find somebody making outrageous claims, I want to talk about what's actually real, so that if something is working for you, you can know why it's working, and also kind of learn when you've been sold a bill of goods. So bottom line, we need to stop with the tribalism, find something that works for you, more power to you. And once again, there is no magic pill, there is no biohacking, there is no quick fix for any of this. It is consistency and hard work over time. When it comes to fat loss, the only quick fix would be liposuction. If you're interested, go see my father. Otherwise, I'm here to help you do the hard work. So, I'm going in alphabetical order with these different diets. We're going to talk about what each diet is, who may benefit from it, who wouldn't do well with it, and any outrageous claims that may be there, what it claims to do. We'll talk about what actually happens. So again, alphabetical order, that's why we're doing this. We've got carnivore, flexible dieting, intermittent fasting, keto or low carb, low fat, paleo, vegan and vegetarian, and zone. I will try not to insult everybody or anybody. If you find yourself getting irritated at any of the information presented in here, check yourself. You've probably given yourself over to the dark side of tribalism, and it's an emotional response. Again, I'm not knocking any single one of these. It's the zealots that I can't stand. So the carnivore diet, what is it? Exactly what it sounds like. You eat only meat, no produce, which means no grains, no fruits, no vegetables. It gained popularity. Liver King was big for a while before he was exposed as a juice head on so many steroids. It also gained prevalence because Jordan Peterson's daughter started doing it and saw an improvement in her blood markers. She had gone from diet to diet. Nothing seemed to improve her health, and her markers got better on the carnivore diet. So Jordan Peterson started doing it, and it worked for him. So who would do well who would do well with this diet? If you really love meat and you've tried everything else and you're at your wit's end, maybe give it a shot. Who would not do well with it? Pretty much everybody else. We generally need micronutrients in our diet. A lot of that is given to us from the vegetables that we eat. That's why we talk about eating leafy greens and things like that. So to completely exclude that from your diet is probably not a good idea for most people. This is one of the more extreme diets out there. Maybe you get away with it for a month or two, but long term, it's probably not the best choice. Like I said, Michaela Peterson had done diet after diet, and this is what seemed to work for her. So very clearly, anecdotally, we know that it can work. But for the vast majority of people, if you want to do carnivore plus greens and not be 100% carnivore, that's not a bad idea. That would be like an extreme version of the paleo diet. So that's what we're talking about here. Flexible dieting is also known as if it fits in your macros. What is it? Based on your activity, you are assigned a set amount of calories for every day. And based on your goals, you divide those calories up into how many calories are going to be allotted from each source of calories: fat, protein, carbohydrates. And how you achieve those goals each day, how I'm going to get my allotted amount of fat, protein, and carbohydrates, is really up to you. That's why it's considered flexible. If I want to eat junk food, as long as it fits within my macros, I'm free to do that. I consider this, we call this a food budget. You have a certain allotment of each. How you get there is up to you. It is your discretion how you want to spend those calories. So who is this approach good for? A lot of appetite and a lot of diet is highly psychological. So for some people, if you tell them that they cannot have a particular food, that's when they start to crave it. Oscar Wilde said it best: the only way to give in to temptation, the only way to resist temptation is to yield to it. In other words, there is no resisting it. You're going to give in. So for people that get that immediate craving when they're told they can't have something, this is a great approach because nothing is off limits. It's just a matter of how much you're allowed to have. And you track everything that you're doing. Who would not do well with it? The dark side of tracking is that some people can turn anything into a disorder, and there are some people that obsess over being dead on with their macros, and it leads to a disorder called orthorexia, where you can't function if you don't hit your macros dead on. Those people would not do well with this approach. There are certain tweaks that we can use, whether it's instead of weighing and measuring their food, maybe we give them a minimum amount of protein that they want to hit, and then we restrict their calories, and then whether or not they do fat or carbohydrates is completely up to them. They don't have to be 100% dead on with their macros. That would be a mitigation strategy, but for other people, it's just not a realistic option. So for people that obsess over tracking to the point that they can't function without it, not a great approach. But ultimately, this is one of our more popular options because of the lack of restriction. Intermittent fasting, I've covered this in a couple of other videos. What is it? There are numerous protocols out there. Basically, I am not allowed to eat for certain hours of the day. Popular protocols include 16 hours of fasting with an 8-hour eating window, or 20 hours of fasting with a 4-hour eating window. There was another one back in the day. I don't see it as a popular approach anymore, but it was called Eat, Stop, Eat, where you have 24-hour fasts every other day. Now you'll see some other, call them health gurus out there, advocating for a temporary 72-hour fast every so often. If you're going to do that, make sure it's under the guidance of a physician. You don't generally want to go 72 hours without food. So, what is it? It is a restrictive eating window. And the claims out there are that you will burn much more fat when you are fasting. This is true. Your body is starving, and we go into the fuel sources that are available to us, the energy storage within our bodies. Another claim that you get is that it increases your human growth hormone, HGH. Yes, this is also true, because one of the functions of HGH in the human body is to liberate fat for energy. So in the absence of food that you are ingesting, in the absence of taking in energy, your HGH is going to spike so that you can burn energy that is available to you. It is not going to help you build muscle unless HGH is present along with carbohydrates and amino acids. So simply fasting, getting a spike in HGH is not anabolic in any way. It's not going to help you build muscle. And again, as soon as you break your fast, you're negating the so-called HGH spike. So it's not the best option for building mass. Who is it good for? If you're someone that snacks all day or fixates over, okay, I just had breakfast, I'm hungry again, I can't wait for lunch, and you fixate on when your next meal is coming, this is a good intervention for you. You know when you're allowed to eat. It's also, I won't say it's impossible, go out for a big steak dinner with a wedge salad, massive ribeye steak, all the bread, all the sides, all the fixins. You could pretty easily go over a 3,000 calorie restriction in a single meal if you're going out to eat. But for the vast majority of people, this is a clever way of not overeating anymore and limiting their caloric intake simply because their eating window is restricted. And if you're eating at your house, it can be challenging, especially if you're doing a 4-hour window. It can be challenging to get your daily allotment of calories. So who would not do well with this? We already covered strength athletes. There are some workarounds. If you train during your feeding window and you get your carbohydrates pre and post training, that's less bad than if you're training during the fasted window. If you are training during a fasted window and you're doing this simply as an intervention, a short-term intervention to try to lose some fat, that's when you want to supplement with branched-chain amino acids during your workout to prevent muscle catabolism. You don't want to burn muscle mass. You only want to burn fat. That can help attenuate that a little bit. But for the most part, if you are a serious athlete or serious strength training person, this is probably not the best intervention for you. Other people that do not do well with this would be high-stress individuals. If you're limiting the amount of time that you're able to eat, you may just end up hangry. And then if you are a shift worker, trying to add a feeding window when you're already working overnight can be extremely challenging to make it work. So if it fits your schedule and you don't get hangry and you feel like you are fresher and sharper on it, which is highly possible. When you're fasting, you can get rid of all that just nasty bloat that sometimes if your diet isn't particularly good to begin with, you store a lot of that bloat right underneath your skin, and doing a fast can quickly get rid of that, and you may feel sharper and ready to go because of it. Then have at it. But again, a lot of the claims here have been blown way out of proportion. Yes, there's a spike in HGH, but it's not really going to benefit you in any way. There's no magic here. Like I said in the beginning of this video, they just did a study of intermittent fasting versus traditional caloric restriction with people actually tracking what they're eating, and the results were exactly the same. It's just another way of getting to caloric restriction. So if it's a strategy that works for you, have at it. If you try it and it doesn't work for you, you're not missing out on anything. Keto is another popular one. What is it? This is an extremely low carb and for the most part low protein diet. In order to be in ketosis, you are burning ketones and ketoesters that your body produces, basically derived from fat. One of the claims associated with this diet is that you're going to burn more fat. You're going to just burn your body's, in the absence of carbohydrates, you're not ingesting any carbs. Your body is going to burn the fat stores that it already has. And while this is true, the fact is our body does not exist in a vacuum. Nothing in the body is static. It is a dynamic system, and there is an equilibrium there with the fat that you eat. Most of the fat that you eat is stored as fat in the body. You are constantly storing fat, and you are constantly burning fat. So I'm eating a higher fat diet, which means that I'm storing more fat, but I'm also burning more fat. So unless I'm in a caloric surplus, in which case I'm going to store body fat, if I am at my maintenance calories, it's net zero. If I am in a caloric deficit, then I will lose weight. So it is a very, very low carbohydrate. I also said low protein diet because you do not need to ingest carbohydrates to survive. Your body can produce carbohydrates, or I should say glucose, which is what we break carbohydrates down into. Your body can create glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis, new creation of glucose. In the absence of carbohydrates, there is a process through which your body will turn protein into glucose. Very hard to store any protein that you eat as adipose tissue, but that's why we don't need carbohydrates to survive. However, you do need both fat and protein to survive. You have essential fatty acids and you have essential amino acids. They're called essential because the body does not produce them naturally. We need to ingest them. So who would do well on a keto diet? People that don't like to eat carbohydrates. There was a school of thought that endurance athletes would do well on keto because for low intensity steady state cardio, you want your primary fuel source to be fat. However, if you are a serious endurance athlete and you're going to be running up a hill or you need a burst of speed here or there in your runs, you're going to go slightly aerobic power or even anaerobic, and those are better fueled by carbohydrates. So if you're not having any carbohydrates and you are in ketosis, you're not going to be able to produce that short-term power. If all you're doing is steady state and you don't care about performance, not a big deal. Have at it. If you only go hiking or if you do light jogs or anything like that, keto is perfectly fine. Also, there's some evidence that diabetics do well on keto. Epileptics do well on keto. It was actually first created to be an intervention for pediatric epilepsy. But again, I'm not a doctor. Talk to your doctor if you suffer from any of those conditions. Who would not do well with it? Anyone that needs power output. If you are a high-intensity athlete, this is the worst choice for you. The vast majority of high-intensity effort is fueled by carbohydrates. And then some people just get a brain fog on it. For some people, keto seems to clear them up and they're not as foggy, they're sharper. For other people, they describe what they get a brain fog. And these, the nervous system and the brain use glucose primarily as a fuel source. So if I'm not efficient at gluconeogenesis and using protein to fuel my glucose needs, you're going to get that brain fog. And everybody's different. So it may not work for you. But again, there is no magic here. You're not burning more fat than you are storing unless you are in a net caloric deficit. So for some people, it's a great option. For others, not so much. And for most of our members that are either part of a strength training program or part of our CrossFit program, I don't generally recommend keto for them. Low fat. Flip side, high carbs. If you look at the food pyramid, the FDA recommends about 60% carbohydrate. So anything below that is technically a low carb diet. And we'll get to that when we cover the zone. But what is low fat? We're talking about 20% of your dietary intake comes from dietary fat. If you go below 20%, you're probably not hitting the minimum need for essential fatty acids, and that's just plain dangerous. But the low fat diet was popularized in the 90s. It is derived from the Mediterranean diet based on the 7-Nation study, which was done by Ansel Keys. He's looking at all these countries, and 7 of them had great health markers, and they tended to follow what was described as the Mediterranean diet, which was low fat. If you actually look at what he did, it was actually a 25-country study. He cherry-picked the 7 that fit his narrative. Not good science. Nobody has ever recreated the study that he has done, which is pretty goddamn telling when it comes to science. If it's not repeatable, it's probably a fluke. But it was popular in the 90s, and you can still find low-fat dressing and all that. It is okay to go, again, down to 20%. Who is it good for? I actually have a client that doesn't digest fat very well. She's got an underlying condition, and this is actually recommended for her. For other people who just prefer to eat carbohydrates, and if you naturally look at your diet and it tends to be higher in carb and protein and lower in fat, then you're de facto doing a low-fat diet. I generally don't advise it for most people. Again, we want a good balance of all 3 macronutrients for the vast majority of people. There's no one that would not do well with this for health reasons unless you're getting uber low, below 20%. But just as we mentioned with the keto diet, sometimes people get that brain fog when they are not eating enough carbohydrates. There are people that respond well to higher carb, and there are people that respond better to higher fat. If you respond well to higher fat, or higher carbs, this might be a good option for you. But again, unless you're in a caloric deficit, you're not going to lose weight. People blame the low-fat diet for the obesity epidemic that we're seeing. That's kind of blown out of proportion. People are trying to blame high fructose corn syrup, which started getting added to a lot of things, but the reality is people's daily caloric intakes went up, not because of high fructose corn syrup, but the dual combination of high fructose corn syrup and high levels of fat. So the hyper-palatable foods that everybody loves to eat, pizza, chips, donuts, cookies, high in both fat and carbohydrates. They're not low fat, and we can't just blame the low fat diet for our epidemic. Because what wound up happening was people followed the food pyramid and were getting 6 to 12 servings of carbohydrates a day, but they were also not following a low fat diet. They were doing fat plus carbs. So, anyway, Paleo. What is it? This was big in the CrossFit world, even though it is not the official diet of CrossFit. The idea is that you eat like our ancestors. No processed foods, no grains, no dairy. Meat, nuts, seeds, fruit, vegetables. There's a little bit of a misnomer here. Processing means altering food from its raw state. A lot of the foods that we eat cannot be eaten raw. Look at root vegetables. They need to be ground, they need to be boiled, they need to be changed in some way so that we can eat them. Probably not the safest to eat nothing but raw meat. We cook it to get rid of parasites and bacteria and things like that. All of that is processing. What people conflate this with is ultra-processed foods that are added, we add to them high fructose corn syrup and we hydrogenize them, saturating the fats. So both high in fat and carbohydrates. That's what creates the hyperpalatable foods. Paleo tends to become a low carbohydrate diet just by virtue of the fact that if you're not eating grains and you're only eating fruit, it's hard to get high levels of carbohydrates. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Who is it good for? Again, we've seen this turn, people that lower the protein intake, we see this turn into a ketogenic diet. So same kind of people might do well on it. There's a number of disorders out there. People that are lactose intolerant might do well on paleo. People that are diabetic might do well on paleo. People that are gluten intolerant will do well on paleo. Who would not do well with it? Again, because it tends to become low carbohydrate. Performance athletes don't tend to do well on paleo. And just a quick note on things that are considered paleo: bacon, tequila are not paleo. I don't know why it bears repeating, but we used to see this, that some dark chocolate was considered paleo. You're just blurring the line. If you're going to have a treat yourself. You don't need to go to a paleo source of things. Same thing kind of goes for keto. You see all these keto cookies and one thing or the next that is labeled. And typically what happens is, with all the substitutions that are made to create this product, it's just as high in calories as the real thing, but it doesn't taste as good. So you end up eating more of it to try to get that same satisfaction, and you end up overeating and negating the reason for having the substitute in the first place. So just, if you're going to treat yourself, just treat yourself. Vegan, vegetarian, for a long time, these were the most tribal of people, which is why I tended to mock them the most. I'm not going to do that here. What is it? If you are a vegan, you do not eat any animal products whatsoever. No dairy, no eggs, no fish, no meat. Hopefully you do not have anything that's leather, and you're true to your lifestyle. Vegetarian, you may get away with dairy. And that's the main difference. Who is it good for? In speaking with vegans, there's generally 3 reasons why people become a vegan. Number 1 is health reasons. Number 2 is sustainability. Number 3 is ethics. When veganism was first introduced, by default, vegans were forced to eat healthy foods. That was the only options available to them. So in the past, yes, you were probably healthier if you were a vegan just by virtue of eating whole foods. Since then, the food industry's gotten in on it, and it is perfectly possible to be vegan and still have a shit diet. So you could be a vegan and be very unhealthy. That's what happens when the food industry gets involved. There's plenty of vegan junk food out there. Now, the flip side of that is also a benefit. One of the issues with veganism is that not a single source of vegan protein is a complete protein, meaning it does not have all of the essential amino acids. So in order to ensure that you were going to survive and be healthy, you had to mix your protein sources. There are now additives to vegan food that fortifies it with all essential amino acids. So it's a lot easier to be a vegan now and get all your essential amino acids. So that's a positive. But it is not inherently healthier. From a sustainability perspective, they're looking at the cost of production of food. A cow takes up a lot more resources than a small plot of corn. However, this is only one factor that's being considered, which is the production factor. They are not considering the cost of transportation. Unless I'm eating locally sourced vegetables that are in season, I'm probably importing my food from somewhere else. There's a carbon footprint associated with the transportation. It is perfectly plausible to be eating chicken from a local free-range farm and have less of a carbon footprint from that than I would from eating fruits and vegetables that I've imported from somewhere. So the argument there is incomplete. Largely, it is an argument against factory farming, which, we'll be honest, is fucking terrible for numerous reasons. But with a few tweaks to factory farming, we could potentially make that a highly sustainable thing. So, sustainability argument is limited. Really, the ethics argument is what comes into play. Factory farming, like we said, is terrible. People like to try to refute the ethics argument by, Ted Nugent has the popular defense: when I hunt and kill an animal, I'm killing one animal and I eat that whole thing. It's going to feed me for a week. Whereas you're going to go wipe out all sorts of rodents and insects in order to grow soy in your soy fields. Where's the calculus into play? You're killing hundreds of animals. I'm only killing one. Again, you're kind of stretching for that argument, but he raises a good point, which we should all consider: the ethical impact of how our food is being processed and what's being wiped out to produce it. That's why we say factory farming is pretty goddamn terrible in that sense. If you're really interested in the ethical calculus, I recommend a video by Renaissance Periodization called 10 Reasons to Consider Going Vegan. Dr. Mike Israel does a fantastic job breaking down the ethical argument, talking about which animals actually experience pain and are closest to humans on that scale, as opposed to, say, insects or fish, which are basically oblivious. So I could get my protein from those sources and still be a little bit more ethical than, say, eating a pig. But I'm not going to get into that here. Who would not do well with the vegan diet? People that like meat. You know? But again, I bring it up because we see the claims about it being healthier and it being sustainable, and that's not necessarily the case. Really, the ethics argument is the one that holds the most weight there. But the only other thing I will say about veganism is, if you are a strength athlete, it can be a challenge because it does require you to eat bigger quantities of food. The protein that you get from these sources is less bioavailable, meaning it's contained in fiber, and you're not netting the same amount. Any animal source, actually eggs are the most bioavailable. You absorb the most protein from an egg based on the protein available. Red meat is up there just below that. So if you, Dr. John Berardi of Precision Nutrition did an experiment where he was a vegan bodybuilder, and he felt bloated a lot of the time because in order to hit his protein needs, he was just eating massive amounts of grains and just felt bloated. So it's just something to consider. You typically have to eat a greater volume of food to absorb the same amount of protein. But again, if it's an approach that works for you, more power to you. And lastly, we have the zone. What is it? It's very much like flexible dieting, but instead of weighing and measuring for macros, each food is associated with a particular macronutrient. So if I'm eating chicken, I ignore the fat content of my chicken. It's just considered a protein, and it is a certain amount of blocks. So this many ounces of chicken is however many blocks. You get a certain amount of blocks based on your height, weight, gender, all that fun stuff. Who is it good for? People that struggle with macros. If you want to weigh and measure your food and macros are too complicated for you, zone is a simple way to do it. Who would not do well with it? Just about everybody else. It's an oversimplification for most people. It's hard to stick to, and it pretty much results in undereating. When I did the zone, which, by the way, is the official diet of the CrossFit world, I was starving because the blocks assigned to me did not provide enough calories overall. Because I was because you're grouping foods into one macro or another, it just got very challenging to stick to my blocks and still get as many calories as I needed to. But the one cool thing about the zone is that it recommends 40% carbohydrates, 30% protein, and 30% fat. It's balanced from that perspective. If you're not an athlete, it's not a bad option. From a health perspective, and even 40% carbohydrate is still considered a low-carb diet because it's less than that 60% that the FDA recommends. So just a little interesting tidbit there. When people think of low-carb, they're thinking like no-carb, and there is a huge spectrum that works there. In any case, I hope this video was informative. I didn't want to bash any particular diet. The goal was to kind of just explain what each one is, who it's good for, and shed some light on what actually happens there. Like we said, any of these can work as long as you're in a caloric deficit for fat loss. If you have underlying health conditions, go see a doctor, but there is no magic pill here. There is no biohack. A lot of the claims that proponents of each diet make are grossly exaggerated. Because there's no way to hack your metabolism or anything like that. It is consistency over time, and it's the hard work that people don't want to do. If you need help with your diet, come see us. That's one of the things that we do. We're happy to come up with a plan that works for you, something that you're going to be able to adhere to, and strategies to allow you to do that. We hope you enjoyed this video. If so, give us a like, give us a subscribe. If you have other topics that you want to hear about, comment below. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, we'll catch you next time.